Hello there. So in this video we're going to have a look at Unit 2, Transport in Plants and Transpiration. So let's get cracking. So as with animal cells, water and other materials can move from cell to cell in a plant by a number of processes. As in multicellular animals, plants have specialised tissues and cells that are adapted for the mass flow of water and other substances. Now you'll remember that mass flow was basically the movement of materials through an organism based on pressure differences, and it usually involved the movement from source to sink. So plants can move large amounts of substances through the organism using their specialised tissues. Now the main two that they've got is one for carrying water and inorganic ions from the roots to the parts above ground, and one for carrying substances made by photosynthesis from the leaves to other areas. Now you might remember from GCSE, the transport system for carrying water and inorganic ions was the xylem, and the one for carrying substances made by photosynthesis from the leaves to other areas was the phloem. So the main thing that the phloem carries is sugars, and they're mainly in the form of sucrose. So just as a reminder from that, photosynthesis is when a plant takes carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose plus oxygen. That takes place in the chloroplasts. The glucose that is produced can be converted into sucrose, which can be transported to other parts of the plant. It can also be converted to starch, but the main point that we're going to be looking at here is how it's converted to sucrose and then transported through the plant. So the vascular tissues then. There are two transport systems in flowering plants. We've got the xylem for water and inorganic ions, and the phloem for organic molecules such as sucrose and amino acids. Now we're going to be looking at each of these in a bit more detail, but the things that we should know about these just before we get into it: the xylem is a one-way transport system from the roots to the leaves, whereas the phloem is a two-way system. And that basically depends on whether the plant is photosynthesizing or not, and as a result of that it can move sugar in different ways. So the xylem and phloem then are contained within the plant's vascular tissues. The vascular tissues form central stele in the root, but peripheral vascular bundles in the stem. In the leaf, the vascular tissues form a large central vascular bundle known as the midrib, from which smaller vascular bundles run through the leaf. Part of the root and stem is also made up of cells in the cortex. These are undifferentiated cells which contain starch grains and may have air spaces between the cells. And this shows simple block diagrams of the root, stem and leaf. So basically what you need to take away from this is that the vascular tissues are found within the root, the stem and the leaves, but their distribution is slightly different in each part. So if we look at this first of all, this diagram here shows the root, a cross section of the root of a plant. So around the outside we have got the epidermis, which goes the whole way around here. So this layer is the epidermis. That's where you find these parts, which are the root hair cells. The next layer in is the cortex, which goes from here to here, and we said that it's undifferentiated cells which might contain a lot of starch grains, and they have air spaces between the cells. And then we've got the central part, this big area in the center, which is the stele, and it is composed of the endodermis, which is a layer going around the outside, and within the stele then we find the xylem, which is this area here, surrounded by little parts of phloem. So the vascular bundles in the root are found within the stele. Now that means that this area outside the root is the soil. So if this is the soil out here, for water and ions to move in, they have to basically enter the root hairs, travel through the epidermis, through the cortex, through the endodermis, and if it's water, it has to travel into there, into the xylem, which we're going to look at later on. This then shows how the vascular bundles are distributed in the stem. So in the stem, the vascular bundles are found around the outside of the stem, where we've got little bundles composed of xylem and phloem. So the phloem is on the outside and the xylem is on the inside. Now the reason why they're arranged like this is because if the xylem and phloem in the vascular bundles are arranged near the outside of the stem, it means that when there's a lot of water in the xylem, it can act as support to especially small plants. Like if you think of a daffodil, if you went out and cut a daffodil, you would see that when you cut it, there would be all these little tubes around the outside and then pretty much a big hollow lumen in there. So by having these vascular tubes around the outside of the stem, it helps support the plant and hold it upright. And finally then we go to the leaf. So in the leaf, we can see again that there's vascular bundles, but because this is a cross section, it's maybe a wee bit more difficult to understand. So if you think of a leaf here, just like a typical one here, what we said was that these little branches will branch off to form smaller vascular bundles. This will go into the leaf, and this is the midrib. Mid meaning middle, so it runs the whole way up here. And then these little things going off are the veins. So this diagram is as if you've taken a cross section there, and we can see the midrib in the center. So this is the midrib here, composed of xylem at the top and phloem at the bottom. And then smaller vascular bundles, which are the veins there. We can see that the smaller vascular bundles are generally found within this layer, which is the spongy mesophyll, because this here is the palisade mesophyll, and we basically want to pack as many cells in there as possible, so we don't want to be taking up space with the xylem and phloem. We'll put the xylem and the phloem in the spongy mesophyll and leave more space in the palisade mesophyll for the photosynthesizing cells. Now the next little section is looking at the xylem and phloem in a little bit more detail. So the xylem tissue is used to transport water and ions. It's a one-way system, and what we're going to see here is that it's made up of dead cells. Now the cells had to be living at one point, but then they die and they change their structure, and that's why it's important to say that they're dead cells here. Now these diagrams then show longitudinal and transverse sections. So let's look at the transverse sections first of all. So the xylem vessels contain thick, strong cell walls containing cellulose and lignin to help support the plant. Lignin is this pretty important material that you only find lining cell walls of the xylem vessels. It's a really strong substance. It's also impermeable to water, which basically means that once water gets into the xylem, it can't get out unless it travels through these little pits, which are little sections of the wall where some water can move out. Which, if you think about it, makes sense to have, because if you've got the stem of a plant going up here, and you've got different leaves branching off in different areas, as the water's moving up, you want a little bit of water to be able to branch off to go to the cells in the stem. So the pits just allow lateral movement of water, which basically just means sideways movement of water out of the xylem. Then the next wee part is, it says that xylem vessels are dead and have no cytoplasm, so all the space inside can be used to transport water and minerals. The xylem vessels then join end to end to form long, continuous tubes to transport water and minerals from the roots to leaves. Now, if we just look at what that actually means, let's say we've got a little shoot of a plant here, and as it's growing, it'll grow new cells. So this is the xylem forming. But what we're saying happens is that as the xylem is forming, once the cell's formed, the cells die, their contents get removed, and their end cell walls break down. And that actually means that the plant forms one big long continuous tube the whole way up through the plant, which is actually really important for transporting water, to have a continuous column of water or a continuous tube going the whole way up the plant. Now moving on then, this diagram just shows the transverse section of the xylem vessel, and this one shows a longitudinal section. So in transverse section, the xylem normally looks a little bit hexagonal, where you can see the cellulose cell wall around the outside. These little gaps that we talked about just now are the pits, which allows lateral water movement. The lumen is where the water and ions will be found. And then the lignified cellulose cell wall basically just means that these cell walls contain lignin to help strengthen it. Now the types of lignification you can have are spiral and annular, or reticulate and pitted. Now these two are generally found in growing parts of the plant. And the reason why they've got these spaces between them is because it allows the xylem to elongate and stretch. As the plant gets older, this lignin will be filled in and it will fully strengthen the xylem. So reticulate and pitted patterns are found in older parts of the plant. And then finally, the longitudinal section here just shows how it would have been made up of cell walls like that. So there's 1, 2, 3 cell walls, but the end cell walls break down once the cell dies and leaves this big, long, continuous column which water can move up. Now, this is a few typical questions related to the xylem. So firstly, what does the xylem transport? It transports water and mineral ions. Now, I should actually add as well there that it's from the roots up the stem to the leaves. How are xylem vessels adapted for water transport? It's made up of dead cells, so they have no cytoplasm or cell content, so there's less resistance to water movement. When the cells die, the end cell walls break down and creates a continuous tube through the plant, which allows a large amount of water to flow. It has a thick cell wall, which is strengthened with lignin, and it's important to say here that that prevents it collapsing under negative pressure. And we'll come back to that a bit later on. It also has pits in the cell wall, which allows the water to move laterally. Now, what is lignin then? It's a strong impermeable substance which lines the xylem vessel. And again, it is there because it stops the xylem prevents the xylem collapsing under negative pressure. The different patterns of lignification are spiral and annular, and reticulate and pitted. The purpose of lignin is it provides strength and prevents the xylem vessel collapsing under negative pressure. So this negative pressure then, and how does lignin come into it? Well, negative pressure is basically a suction force. So you go to McDonald's, you get your wee milkshake, and because I've changed them to paper straws, you've got to wait a couple of minutes before you can actually drink your milkshake. And that's because whenever you try and drink your milkshake here, the suction that you create squeezes the straw and it collapses in on itself. And it means that your milkshake can't get through. Now, that suction actually happens as well in plants. When water is evaporating out through the leaves in transpiration, it pulls the water molecules up behind it. So The water evaporates here and it pulls the water up through the xylem right away from the stem and from the roots. Because in summertime there can be so much water evaporation out through the plants, it creates this really negative pressure, and it can actually put a lot of strain on the xylem, which, if you're looking at this tree, most of its trunk is xylem. So that could actually, the force of the water being pulled out here could actually squeeze the trunk in. And if it wasn't for this lignin, the xylem vessel would actually collapse in on itself, and water, or the transport of water and ions from the roots, would actually stop. So this lignin helps strengthen the xylem and prevents its collapse under negative pressure, which is basically the suction created by transpiration. So the main things to take away from this is that the xylem transports water and ions. We need to know how it's adapted for water transport. And we also need to know the function of lignin, which is to prevent the collapse of the xylem under negative pressure. Now, this is just two little photographs of it. So this one shows a section which is in longitudinal section. It says that the young vessel on the right, which is this part, has spiral lignification, whereas the one on the left are older and have more extensive coverings of lignin with many pits. So this here would be the pitted form of lignification. This diagram then shows the transverse section of a xylem, and the lignin appears red in it. So you can see that if these are all xylem vessels here, that they have an awful lot of lignin within their cell walls. Now the next vessel then is the phloem. So the phloem is used to transport sugar in the form of sucrose, and also we said it's a two-way system, and it's made up of living cells. The two types of living cells are known as sieve tube elements and companion cells. How cute. So again, we're looking at transverse sectional and longitudinal section. So in transverse section, we can see here that these are the sieve tubes, and beside that we have these sieve plates with the little companion cells there. So these two are the sieve tube elements, and this here is the companion cell. This sieve tube actually just shows you the top of a sieve plate, which also shows the sieve pores. Now, I realise in transverse section that doesn't really mean much to you, so hopefully in longitudinal section it'll be a bit easier to understand. So if you look at the longitudinal section here, we can see here that this is the sieve tube. Now this entire thing, it's made up here of 1, 2, 3 cells. Okay, so those 3 cells together is the sieve tube, but this one cell by itself is called a sieve tube element. Now, you can see here that the sieve tube element have a modified cytoplasm with few organelles, and that's basically trying to remove stuff so that we can transport more sugars up through this tube. A little bit like the way the xylem cells had no cell contents because it provided less resistance to water movement, the sieve tube elements contain fewer organelles and fewer contents so that sugars can be transported more easily. But that's where these little cells come in. So this cell here, just to the side of it, is a companion cell. It's called a companion cell because it's a little friend at the side. Now, it has a really important role in transporting sugar. The sugar transport in the sieve tubes requires energy, and it's the companion cells which are involved in this process. So what you can see here in the companion cells is loads and loads of mitochondria, and they provide ATP for the transport of sugar in the sieve tubes. Another reason why we'd say they're very active is because they have a very dense cytoplasm. Now, this is a slightly different diagram, but it actually shows you a lot of the same things. So we've got one sieve tube element here, which is one of the cells that makes up the phloem. The other cell is the companion cell. Now, both of these cells are living. But what we can see in this diagram, which is maybe a bit easier to see, is that we've got a plasmodesmata in two areas here, which helps join the companion cell with the sieve tube element. Now, you'll remember from Unit 1 in cells that plasmodesmata is a really thin strand of cytoplasm which extends between two plant cells, and it makes it easier for substances to be moved between two adjacent plant cells. So in this case, it's important because the companion cell provides the ATP required to move the sugars up or down the phloem. Now, in the xylem, we said that the end cell walls, after it forms, were broken down to form a continuous tube. It's similar in the phloem, but not exactly the same. In the phloem, we have these little bits. The end cell walls are perforated, which basically means there's little holes in them, or there's little pores. And these pores make it easier to move sugar up or down through them. So by being perforated, it basically just makes it easier to move sugars up or down. Now again, here's some typical questions that you would get to do with the phloem. So what's the function of the phloem? And it is to transport sugars in a two-way system, usually from source to sink. Now we'll come back to that and talk about where the source would be and where the sink would be later on. What cells make up the phloem? The sieve tube elements, which also have companion cells which are joined to them via plasmodesmata. Unlike the xylem, the cells which make up the phloem are living. And then the structure of the sieve tubes. Sieve tubes are formed when sieve tube elements are arranged end to end. End cell walls are also known as sieve plates. They are perforated, and those are called sieve pores, to make the movement of materials easier. What are companion cells and what organelles do they possess and why? Companion cells are linked via plasmodesmata to sieve tube elements. They have large numbers of mitochondria and are metabolically very active. The companion cells do not transport the materials but provide energy in the form of ATP. We should say there from aerobic respiration for the sieve tube elements, so that the sieve tube elements can transport the materials. These lose their nuclei and organelles as they mature. Now this just shows you a little diagram of the xylem and the phloem. So the xylem will go the whole way from the roots to the leaves. And if we're talking about mass flow here, the source is the roots, the sink is the leaves. In the phloem it's slightly different. Because we can move sugars two ways, it is a little bit different. So in the phloem, mass flow is a little bit different. In the summer, the best conditions for photosynthesis are usually round then, where there's lots of light. So that means the plant's going to photosynthesize, produce a lot of sugar, and it's going to want to store it. So the source is going to be the leaves, where the sugar is produced. And it's going to want to transport it downwards and store it in the potato. So that's going to be the sink. Whereas in the winter, it's going to be the opposite. Less photosynthesis is taking place. So the sugars that are stored in the potatoes as starch are going to get broken down and transported as sucrose upwards into the leaves. And that's pretty much the end of this first section. Thank you, goodbye.